Hello friends, my name is Ihor Havryshchak. Today is June 5, Thursday on our calendar. I would like to offer you an analysis of the most important news from this truly crazy world, which of course primarily relates to our Ukraine. Before we begin, I would like to ask you to be active. Please like this video, write where you are watching us from, your questions, comments, suggestions, and of course we welcome your feedback. It is very important. In this way, we promote Ukrainian YouTube, Ukrainian language YouTube, Ukrainian language content, and, of course, our pro-Ukrainian position, thus displacing Kremlin propaganda. So what are we going to talk about? Donald Trump became Putin's spokesman for a while, and instead of Dmitry Peskov, he actually announced the Kremlin's response to the downed aircraft. Putin, 4 days after the phenomenal operation of the security service of Ukraine in attacking the aviation of the Russian Federation, opened the front of his face, his head, and complained to the whole world that Ukrainian heroes are phenomenal and destroy the Russian Federation. In the end, the European Union found ways to bend Fico and Orban. And of course, let's talk about Vladimir Zelensky's response to all these really false messages from the Russian Federation yesterday and today.
Звичайно ж, поговоримо про відповідь Володимира Зеленського на всі ці справді брехливі меседжі протягом вчорашнього і сьогоднішнього дня від Російської Федерації.
To begin with, the security service of Ukraine showed footage of the destruction of Russian aircraft on June 1st. This is the famous Operation Spider's Web. Indeed, a large number of aircraft at 4 military airfields were destroyed. There is such beautiful footage of the Russian Federation's equipment burning. It's just beautiful. And of course, Putin was silent for a very long time. He didn't know what to say. He was hiding. He was shocked by the attack on the aviation and its illegal construction. I mean the Crimean Bridge, which goes from the swamps to our Crimea. But still, he unexpectedly spoke on the phone with Donald Trump. And this conversation was reported by the 47th President of the United States himself. He said he had spoken on the phone with dictator Putin. The conversation, Trump said, lasted 1 hour and 15 minutes. He wrote about it on his social media account. During the conversation, Trump says Putin said he would have to respond to the recent attack on the airfields. We quote Donald Trump further. "I just got off the phone with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The conversation lasted approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes. We discussed Ukraine's attack on Russian Federation strategic aircraft, as well as various other attacks that have been going on both sides. It was a good conversation, but not a conversation that will lead to immediate peace." According to Trump, Putin did say, and in very strong terms, that he would have to respond to the recent attack on the airfields. "We also talked about Iran," Trump said, "and the fact that time is running out for Iran's decision on nuclear weapons, and it has to be made quickly. I'm with Putin, that Iran cannot have nuclear weapons." And then they talked about the Middle East. What's important to note is that Trump actually announced with this recording that the Russian Federation terrorist organization might strike in Ukraine. He did not condemn. He traditionally did not even write that he wanted the war and peace to end. He simply said, "Putin told me that he will attack Ukraine." And in fact, if we could see Trump's face, he might have been smirking. But the very fact that he was simply relaying what Putin had told him, he was, for a second, as I said, Dmitry Peskov's spokesman. That's all you need to know about the conversation between Trump and Putin. Moreover, Trump does not mention the constant attacks, terrorist strikes, and genocide of the Ukrainian population. He only talks about retaliation. Yesterday, the U.S. Embassy wrote that Russia has increased the intensity of its missile and drone attacks against Ukraine in recent weeks, and there is now a constant risk of significant air attacks. At the same time, the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine urges American citizens to be cautious and be prepared to take shelter immediately in the event of an air raid alert.
закликають американських громадян бути обережними і бути готовими негайно сховатися у разі оголошення повітряної тривоги.
In particular, the U.S. Embassy recommends that people decide on shelters in advance in case of an air raid. Americans were also urged to immediately take shelter away from windows and in the most protected places in case of a threat. This was reported yesterday by the United States of America, and we see that the United States knows something. Moreover, Putin probably told Trump where and how he would strike. But what's most interesting is that Trump first deleted the post and then returned it. Moreover, he not only returned the post, but feeling that he had become an accomplice to Putin's crime by announcing his strike, he decided to repost the Washington Post article on his social media. The article said that Congress could give him leverage to put pressure on Putin by passing a law on new sanctions against Russia. The Washington Post article also mentions that Putin obviously does not want peace, so he should be forced to end the war.
Ухваливши закон про нові санкції проти Росії. Також у цьому матеріалі Washington Post згадується, що Путін, вочевидь, не хоче миру, тож його потрібно змусити припинити війну.
To do this, Trump needs more leverage. Congress can provide this by passing a law on sanctions against Russia. That's how quickly Trump decided to rehabilitate himself. Speaking of this bill, Senator Lindsey Graham said he would add an exception for countries that support Ukraine. According to him, he will add an amendment to his bill on sanctions against Russia to exempt countries that provide assistance to Ukraine from high import duties. Many countries, Graham says, still buy Russian oil and gas, but some European countries, while maintaining relations with Russia, have been very helpful to Ukraine, so he wants to remove them from the sanctions now. Tell China, Graham wrote, if you don't want to have 500% tariffs, help Ukraine, he said. Graham also did not provide an updated timeline for when the sanctions bill would be brought to a vote, but said he was in constant contact with Trump.
Оновлених термінів, коли законопроект про санкції буде внесений на голосування, але сказав, що він перебуває в постійному контакті з Трампом.
Asked whether Trump has to give the green light before the sanctions bill can be brought to the Senate floor for a vote, Graham said, and I think we are separate entities here, coordinating with each other. Graham, either you think or you know, and to say I think we are subjects is an absolute laughing matter. It's worth noting that immediately after this conversation, obviously, between Trump and Putin decided to continue to play the victim. But first, let's talk about how Volodymyr Zelensky promptly responded to the phone call between Trump and Putin on his Telegram channel in the evening. In his Telegram, Volodymyr Zelensky wrote, "With every new blow, every new delay in diplomacy, Russia gives the middle finger to this world." The president recalled that since the beginning of this year, the Russian army has struck Ukraine with almost 28,000 bombs, almost 12,000 Shaheds, and almost 9,000 other types of attack drones, as well as more than 700 missiles, including ballistic missiles. This is in less than 6 months. You realize that this is in the tens of thousands. Why the 47th is silent about this is a mistake of the American people.
Майже 9 тисяч ударних безпілотників інших типів, а також понад 7 сотень ракет, у тому числі балістичних. Це менше, як за півроку. Ви розумієте, це в десятках тисяч це налічується. Чому про це мовчить 47-ма помилка американського народу?
We quote the president below. Many people have talked to Russia at various levels, and no talks have led not only to a lasting peace but even to stopping the war. Unfortunately, Putin feels impunity, and even after all the terrible Russian strikes, he is allegedly preparing some more responses. This means that with every new strike, every new delay, everyone who is unwilling to increase pressure on Russia, even though Russia should be seeking peace, will be punished. According to Volodymyr Zelensky, if the powers that be do not stop Putin, they share responsibility with him. And if they want to, but cannot stop him, Putin will no longer recognize them as strong. Well, we understand perfectly well to whom this message was addressed, to whom Vladimir Zelensky said that Russia was giving the middle finger, of course to the United States of America. Then Putin tried to whitewash himself, showing the whole world that he was a victim. Because in fact, this strike on aviation, you will understand, is the lion's share of Russia's military machine, if not the key one. That is, the strategic bombers that were flying every day and destroying Ukraine are 30% useless. Some are completely destroyed, and some are so damaged that it will take months or even longer to repair. So Putin decided to complain to someone you can't even imagine, the new Pope Leo XIV. First of all, what did the Pope say after his conversation with Putin? In a conversation with the dictator, Leo XV called on Russia to make a gesture that would promote peace. We quote, "The Pope called on Russia to make a gesture conducive to peace, emphasizing the importance of dialogue to create positive contacts between the parties and find solutions to the conflict," said Matteo Bruni, director of the Holy See's press office. They also discussed the humanitarian situation and efforts to exchange prisoners. It is worth noting here that the special representative, Ukrainian ambassador Andrian Yurash to the Vatican, said that this is a demonstration of Putin's weakness because he had absolutely no contact with the previous pope, and he has already called this pope, which shows that his position has shaken. This opinion can be supported. Indeed, Putin panicked, because we see that this operation has actually turned the world of warfare upside down. I mean the operation of the security service of Ukraine. But there is another opinion to be expressed here, and you can write in the comments whether you agree that, first of all, the new Pope is different from the previous Francis. He doesn't say that Ukraine and Russia should reconcile. He doesn't organize processions in the Vatican, where there are supposedly representatives of both sides, an illustration of Russia and Ukraine united. Pope Louis XIV says directly that Russia is an imperial country with aggressive intentions, that it is attacking and occupying Ukraine. It's also worth noting that Putin is being cunning. He wants to show the whole world that they want peace, but Ukraine does not. And they have taken this operation on board, calling all over the world and complaining. By the way, Lavrov also complained, and I'll tell you about that. So this call to the Pope means that Putin wants to show that he is open to the world, that he is not in isolation, that he is in contact even with the main religious leaders of the world, and generally paints a picture that poor Putin has been offended.
Головними релігійними лідерами світу цього і загалом малює картину, наче бідного Путіна образили.
Well, in fact it is, because he was not just insulted, but our security service of Ukraine gave him a slap on the back of his shriveled head. In addition, Putin held a meeting with the government yesterday and rejected the Ukrainian president's proposal for a 30-day truce at the front. The dictator said that the Ukrainian government had allegedly turned to organizing terrorist acts amid heavy losses and retreats along the entire front line. In this context, he mentioned the collapse of bridges in the Bryansk and Kursk regions, which Russian security forces called terrorist attacks, then withdrew the statement, and later called them terrorist attacks again. There's an interesting story there, and I'll tell you about it in a moment. What does Putin say about this? How to hold meetings in such circumstances and what to talk about? Who negotiates with someone who relies on terror, with terrorists? Explaining his unwillingness to stop hostilities for 30 days, Putin said that this truce would be used to supply the regime with Western weapons, continue mobilization, and prepare other terrorist acts.
Пояснюючи своє небажання припинити бойові дії на 30 днів, Путін заявив, що перемир'я буде використано для накачування режиму західною зброєю для продовження насильницької мобілізації та підготовки інших терористичних актів.
ChatGPT said, accusing Ukraine of terrorism, Putin referred to the strikes in Kursk and Bryansk regions. But what is the point? The Russians blew up bridges in these regions themselves. At first, the investigative committee said it was a terrorist attack. Then they said it wasn't. And yesterday, Bastrikin, the head of the Russian investigative committee, reported to Putin that investigators had allegedly gathered evidence that Ukraine was behind the bridge explosions. According to Bastrikin, traces of foreign-made explosives were found at the scenes. I think they had inscriptions on them, made in USA by Joe Biden. Ukrainian control units were used for the explosions, possibly with a Trident and Yarosh's business card. the head of the investigative committee said. He also said that 13 Kharkiv plasted and Ukrainian-made control units were seized from a cache in the Bryansk region, near the village of Mikishevo, and 2 explosive devices were found on the stretch between Unecha and Zhecha stations that did not work. Of course, to accuse us of a terrorist attack, they say, "Oh, look, we found them."
Микишеве зі схованки вилучили 13 кілограмів пластиду та блоки управління українського виробництва. На перегоні між станціями Унеча та Жеча знайшли 2 вибухові пристрої, які не спрацювали. Ну, звісно, як звинуватити в теракті? Ти кажеш, опа, дивіться, ми знайшли.
How could it be otherwise? I think they haven't searched very hard yet, and Kuchma's book Ukraine is not Russia is still lying around. But they are not looking well, because they work very quickly. It's actually very funny. Also, those who complain, it turns out that poor Russia has been offended and needs to seek influence on Ukraine. After a successful operation by the security service of Ukraine to eliminate Russian strategic aviation, Lavrov's deputy, Sergei Ryabkov, demanded a clear response from the United States and the United Kingdom to stop the escalation. Russian media quoted Ryabkov as saying, "Russia demands that Washington and London influence Kyiv to stop this cycle of escalation." The silence of London and other Western capitals is very telling. They at least welcome what happened and may have been involved in the preparations. Ukraine's attacks were an attempt to disrupt the second round of talks in Istanbul, but Russia showed maximum restraint and the meeting still took place, Lavrov's deputy assures. Well, by the way, Ryabkov is right about our partners welcoming this attack, but he is lying about their participation, because no one did, the United States did not know about this attack, and in general the world was shocked in a good way by the way Ukraine conducted an operation to destroy the strategic aviation of the Russian Federation. Let me remind you that this is exactly how we started the summer of 2025 for Russia, destroying their air power. How did the world react? Here Ryabkov is right. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius praised the Ukrainian operation to destroy Russian strategic bombers, calling it an impressive achievement whose significance cannot be overstated. He said this in a conversation with journalists. On Sunday, a truly impressive drone strike was carried out deep in the Russian rear, in particular against Russian long-range bombers in Siberia, which is an extraordinary achievement that cannot be overestimated. Thousands of kilometers from the Ukrainian border, from the front line. The German minister also pointed to the Ukrainian attack on the Kerch Bridge. This demonstrates 2 very important things. First, Pistorius said, Ukraine is not giving up. On the contrary, it is creative, remains motivated, and defends itself wherever it can, with great success. Second, it sends a clear message. It shows Putin and the Russian population that Russia has not been able to achieve its strategic and military goals in Ukraine, and is unlikely to be able to achieve them in the foreseeable future. The UK Secretary of Defense praised the attack, emphasizing support for Ukraine. We see that Ukraine can impact Russian weapons, and we will support Ukraine as much as possible. NATO Secretary General Marco Rutte announced Ukraine's official invitation to the June NATO summit in The Hague. When asked about the attack, the response was, "We can't respond to every attack."
На запитання про цю атаку журналіст сказав: "Послухайте, ми не можемо реагувати на кожну атаку."
This was Rutte's diplomatic response, and then he added, "But as far as I know, it was this aircraft that was destroyed by the Ukrainians to the Russians that Putin used for daily bombing, for daily destruction of Ukraine's infrastructure, and of course, for the murder and genocide of the Ukrainian people." Kellogg's reaction, was that this is the U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine under Trump, and to be honest, it's worth watching what he said in full. Both to please Trump and to emphasize that he is fascinated by this attack. Because what did he say? Keith Kellogg told Fox News that Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian air bases with strategic aircraft raise the risk of war escalation. attacking Russia's nuclear triad increases danger, and the Kremlin's reaction is unpredictable. The US government aims to avoid reaching this point.
Виживання противника, а саме його ядерна тріада, тоді рівень ризику зростає. Келлог навіть додав, що в цьому питанні неможливо передбачити, як саме відреагує Кремль. Він підкреслив, що це саме те, чого влада США намагається уникнути, оскільки досягнення цієї точки було б небажаним.
This is the part of Kellogg's statement that is consistent with the 47th president's rhetoric. Kellogg went on to agree that the psychological impact of the Pavlina operation is much more serious than the material losses of the Russian Federation caused by the destruction of the bombers. Kellogg believes that the Ukrainian special operation has caused enormous damage to the image of the Russian Federation, showing that Ukraine is not going to give up. Ukraine is essentially saying, "We can play this game too," Keith Kellogg emphasized. Since yesterday, Ukrainian media have spread Kellogg's statement as if he condemned the attack. But in context he said, "What the White House wants to hear," highlighting how Ukraine weakened Russia and damaged its image by hitting its nuclear aviation. He also recalled the White House's reaction to the SBU attack.
Як вона вдарила по іміджу Російської Федерації, і та країна-терорист, яка кричала, що ми весь світ накриємо ядерними ударами, не може зберегти свою частину ядерної тріади, тобто авіацію. Ну, от такі от удари. І нагадаю вам, лише Білий дім, як відреагував на атаку СБУ.
He said that Trump wants peace. Trump wants the war to end. Regarding weapons in Ukraine, arms packages, let me remind you that the Ukrainian delegation was in the United States, headed by the head of the president's office, Andriy Yermak, where they discussed two areas of negotiations, a free economic zone and the possible purchase of an arms package. The United States remains focused on preserving President Trump's ability to end hostilities, so no decisions have been made on future aid, a U.S. diplomat said when asked about the possibility of supplying Ukraine with U.S. weapons. His name is Whitaker, U.S. ambassador to NATO. He also emphasized that the United States is counting on Europe's leadership in providing Ukraine with the resources and political capital necessary to achieve a lasting peace. Europeans have a vested interest in securing peace on their continent, and the United States will continue to do everything we can to support that.
Європейці зацікавлені у забезпеченні миру на своєму континенті, а Сполучені Штати продовжуватимуть робити все можливе для підтримки цього.
And in fact, the American Bloomberg says that they will support this. The U.S. representative to NATO officially says that they will. But in fact, the U.S. refused to provide air defense assets to support the deterrence forces that the UK and France plan to deploy in Ukraine in the post-war period. It is worth noting here that there are enough air forces in European countries to close part of the sky over our homeland. And about the contingent, it is also worth mentioning the Telegraph, which summarized the conversation of the coalition of the Resolute, where they decided that their primary task now would be to provide long-term support and everything necessary for the Ukrainian defense forces. But the contingent is being relegated to the background, and perhaps they will not talk about it at all. Frankly, we have already mentioned that we do not believe in a European contingent in Ukraine. I do not believe that it can appear, and I simply do not see what it can do. Will it stop Russia before a possible new attack?
Не віримо ми в це. Я не вірю в те, що він може з'явитися. Тобто я просто не бачу, що він може зробити. Ну, він буде зупиняти Росію перед можливою новою атакою.
No, of course, this would only be European countries exposing their soldiers to death. And democratic countries are very, very afraid of this, because they need to win elections there. And it is also unlikely that they will engage in combat, even if they have a mandate. They have no training or practice in these battles. Of course, our defense forces can teach them, but we are well aware that this is more politicking, more statements by Emmanuel Macron, who says a lot but does much less or differently. Why am I talking about this? Because, Macron is shouting about helping Ukraine, but it is France and Brussels that are rejecting the proposal in the European Union to stop buying energy from the Russian Federation by 2027. I'm talking about liquefied natural gas. They are the largest buyers of Russian natural gas, and France and Belgium refuse to look for an alternative until 2027. Let's talk more about gas. I would like to remind you that yesterday a regular meeting of defense ministers of the countries that support Ukraine in the Ramstein coalition took place.
Хочу вам нагадати, що вчора булося чергове засідання міністрів оборони країн світу підтримки України в коаліції Рамштайн.
This was the first time that a representative of the United States of America was not present. But even if this hexagon does not and will never be rolled up, we do not need its presence at the moment, because it is, as they say, as useless as a bull's milk. At the 28th meeting in the Ramstein format, a number of countries announced their support for Ukraine and new aid packages. These are the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, Canada, and Sweden. All of them allocated funds for various means necessary for defensive and offensive operations against the Russian Federation. Many announcements at the meeting had been made before. It was mostly official. Zelensky attended online. Germany is seeking Patriot systems for Ukraine and is willing to buy them at its own cost, said Defense Minister Boris Pistorius. Germany has already provided Ukraine with a quarter of its Patriots and cannot give more.
Німеччини Борис Пісторіус. За його словами, Німеччина вже віддала Україні чверть наявних у неї комплексів Patriot і не в змозі дати більше.
I would also like to note that they are actively cooperating, and Germany said at Ramstein that it would repeat what it had provided to Ukraine and would provide Ukraine with 5 billion in European aid this year. So how did Europe decide to bend Tychitsia and Orban? In mid-June, the European Commission plans to present draft regulations on phasing out Russian energy imports by the end of 2027, which, among other things, will include the introduction of a zero quota on natural gas imports. According to a Bloomberg source, the presentation may take place on June 17th. In addition to the zero quota on Russian gas imports, the package of measures will also include tools for the gradual abandonment of Russian oil and restrictions on new contracts for the supply of uranium and other nuclear materials. Bloomberg journalists note that the zero import quota for Russian natural gas will allow European companies to invoke force majeure to terminate agreements with Russian suppliers. It will be directly applicable in all EU member states, and officials expect its effectiveness to be equivalent to the sanctions regime.
В усіх країнах-членах ЄС, і чиновники очікують, що її ефективність буде прирівняна до режиму санкцій.
Bloomberg emphasizes that a qualified majority of national governments, as well as a majority of members of the European Parliament, would be required to introduce a de facto ban on Russian gas imports. At the same time, the quota on Russian gas imports will not require the support of all 27 EU members, and thus will allow to circumvent the veto of Hungary and Slovakia, which continue to import Russian pipeline gas. According to its two-stage roadmap, the European Commission intends to ban short-term contracts for Russian gas imports by the end of 2025 and to finally abandon the blue fuel by 2027. Well, I mentioned France and Belgium, but it's important to note that the European Union would have a problem if it wanted to traditionally vote for a zero quota, which means to abandon quotas altogether, which is force majeure, where there is no accepted vote on how to receive Russian gas, and then the contracts with Russia are terminated unilaterally. But Hungary and Slovakia, Fico and Orban, could have voted for this and vetoed it. So they decided to go the other way, thus bypassing and bending these two, Biba and Boba, who regularly communicate and do what the Russian Federation does and what Moscow tells them to do. In conclusion, I would like to tell you the following. The Russian Federation's oil revenues fell last month to the lowest level since June 2023. That is, over the past 2 years, the reason for the decline in state budget revenues was the decline in world crude oil prices.
Причиною зменшення надходжень до державного бюджету стали зниження світових цін на нафту, сиру, так?
Bloomberg writes that according to the Russian terrorist organization's Ministry of Finance, oil-related taxes fell by 32% in May compared to the previous period. Falling prices also play an important role here, as production has increased, as well as ridiculous as it may sound, a strong ruble, because the stabilization of the ruble and the falling dollar is also a problem for Russia. Let me explain again. Russia sells oil for $60. Before the dollar was worth about 100 rubles. Now it's 80, so Russia gets less rubles out of those $60, which means less money goes to the budget. Although the price of oil they set was completely different at $70. Then it dropped. But the fact is that there is a growing hole in the budget of the Russian Federation. And this is great because it directly affects the financing of the Russians' war of aggression in Ukraine.